I want to talk just a second or two, excuse me, about the lesson 7 and 7.1, 7.2. Mainly I want to talk about 7.1, the discussion board activity. It was really kind of interesting to hear about some of the cuts that many of your schools have made. Some I would agree with and some that I wouldn't. And one of the things that I think you start seeing is sometimes when schools start trying to make budget cuts, they get into paper and photocopier and those kinds of things that cause a lot of frustration for teachers, and I think maybe makes the process tougher than it needs to be. The some of the things that you talked about, the way that your administrators had worked on some cooperatives and some of those types of activities, I think those are probably necessities. But you do want to remember that most of the expenses for a school are personnel. So if there's ways that can be accomplished by reducing personnel or hiring somebody that can maybe fill 2 positions or have 2 endorsements, I think that's one of the things that small schools particularly can do. But there are some things that can have an effect. One of the things I remember I did was we put a counter on the photocopier. We were really having, seemed like a lot of copies going out, and so the teachers had to punch in their number when they were doing a photocopy, and I never looked at it. My principals, I don't think they ever looked at it either, but it did reduce the amount by 40%. So there were probably some things that were being run off that didn't necessarily have to happen. But the idea of, some of you talked about reduction in force, and that can have a really negative effect on school personnel, and everybody gets to talking about who's going to go or why they're going to go, and everybody can always find another program that ought to be gone. And so I would hesitate to throw that out there very often if I was an administrator. The other thing that one of the issues that someone talked about was closing a building. And a couple, 3 of you had talked about buildings in your district that could be closed. That really becomes sometimes a very political issue, and eventually it usually does happen. But as a superintendent, probably more than a principal, you have to weigh that a little bit as to how it's going to affect your district, just the way that people sometimes get upset. But as we mentioned, really they'll say 80 to 85% of your budget is actually personnel costs. And so those are the things I think you have to focus on, and you want to focus on the ones that are farthest away from students, and I think you're all very aware of that. And a couple of you in your answers, first I'd say some of you failed to really fill out this last part of that, as if you were in the position of the superintendent or principal, how would you determine what cuts are going to be made? And some of you talked about having a process where teachers and community people would evaluate it. I've done quite a few presentations, I and Marge Beatty, who's an administrator at the service unit in western Nebraska. And there's a process called the essential financial planning process, and really there is some ways that you can make those decisions, and when you're done, it's very helpful in getting your community to buy into some of the cuts that you're making. Sometimes young administrators can make cuts that are really have a negative effect in their community, and I can think of some schools that have a really strong band program, and although that might not be core curriculum in that community, if you made those kinds of cuts, well, you'd probably be looking for a job down the road. I do think the idea of hiring flexibility is really important in these tough times. trying to hire people that have endorsements and in a couple areas so that you could do something. It's always easier to hire one less teacher than it is to fire a teacher, and so if you can make those things happen. And sometimes we had to make some major cuts at one of the schools I was at, and in some cases the teachers volunteered. There were a couple teachers that we had, four English teachers, and one said, I'd be happy to go half time. I've got a young family, and so there's some things that you can, if you work with your staff, you can make happen. So yeah, overall, I think you did a good job of responding to that. It was just interesting for me to read those. I hope you take the time to read some of the other students' material.